Sylvester Stallone gave up his first-class seat for a veteran, but what happened next left the entire plane in stunned silence. The air inside Los Angeles International Airport felt thick with movement. Travelers hurried past each other, some pulling suitcases behind them, others balancing coffee cups and boarding passes. Among them was Sylvester Stallone, dressed casually, dark jeans, a fitted jacket, and aviator sunglasses perched low on his nose. He had taken plenty of flights before, but this one would be different. As he made his way through the terminal, he barely drew attention. Passengers were too wrapped up in their own travels to notice. He liked it that way. No cameras, no autograph requests, just a quiet moment before a long flight. At gate 47, he handed his boarding pass to the attendant, nodded politely, and stepped into the jet bridge. First class was half full, the kind of crowd that knew luxury but didn't make a show of it. He slid into seat 2A, stretching out before takeoff, watching the rest of the passengers trickle in. That's when he saw him. An elderly man, maybe in his late 70s, struggling to make his way down the narrow aisle. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the overhead compartments for balance. His duffel bag, old, worn, the canvas edges frayed, swung clumsily against his side. He adjusted the cap on his head, the emblem of a Vietnam War veteran stitched across the front. A flight attendant noticed him too, stepping forward. "Sir, can I help you?" The veteran waved her off. "I got it, sweetheart." His voice was gravelly, weathered, carrying the weight of time. Passengers in business class watched in silence as he shuffled forward. Some looked away, pretending not to notice. Others glanced up briefly before going back to their screens, their books, their headphones. But Stallone didn't look away. He could see it. The way the old man winced with every step. How his bag seemed to pull him down. How his knees barely held him up. The veteran was heading toward the back, all the way to economy. Stallone didn't hesitate. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up and caught the flight attendant's attention. "Let him take my seat." But the old man wasn't the only one who heard him. The air in first class shifted. Conversations quieted. The rustling of newspapers and the tapping of fingers on phone screens paused. The veteran stopped in his tracks, his bushy gray eyebrows pulling together as he turned to face the voice that had spoken. Sylvester Stallone stood there, his stance relaxed but firm, one hand gesturing toward the plush leather seat he had just vacated. "Sir?" Stallone said, his voice calm but certain. "You take this one." The veteran blinked as if he hadn't heard right. Then, with a dry chuckle, he shook his head. "Son, I've been in tighter spots than economy. I'm fine where I am." Stallone took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You serve this country. This is the least I can do." The old man studied him, his wrinkled hands tightening around the strap of his duffel. He glanced around as if expecting someone to object. Instead, the surrounding passengers sat frozen, eyes darting between the two men. A flight attendant stepped forward, sensing the moment. "Sir, if you'd like to take Mr. Stallone's seat, we can arrange for your bag to be stored up front as well." The veteran exhaled sharply through his nose. His pride was battling his exhaustion, his instincts telling him to refuse. But he could feel it. The pain in his legs, the stiffness in his back that hadn't left him in years. He looked at Stallone again, then at the seat. "You sure about this?" Stallone smiled. "I insist." Slowly, carefully, the veteran set his bag down and eased into the seat. As he settled in, his shoulders dropped, as if he hadn't realized just how tired he was. A ripple of applause swept through the cabin. Some passengers clapped politely, others more enthusiastically. The flight attendant offered him a warm smile, adjusting his seatbelt with care. The old man glanced up at Stallone. His voice was softer now, almost hesitant. "Thank you." Stallone nodded, reaching out. They shook hands. Firm, steady, no words needed. He turned to make his way to the back of the plane, but before he could take a single step, a man from a few rows behind suddenly stood up, his face pale, his eyes locked on the veteran. The moment hung in the air, thick with something unspoken. The man who had stood up, a middle-aged guy in his 40s, clean-shaven, dressed in a button-down and slacks, stared at the veteran like he had seen a ghost. His hands gripped the seat in front of him, knuckles white. His breath hitched, His lips parted as if trying to form words, but nothing came out. The veteran furrowed his brow. "You all right, son?" Silence stretched between them. Then the man swallowed hard and took a slow step forward. "My father," he finally said, voice thick, "was in your unit." The veteran's face shifted, his expression unreadable. He tilted his head slightly, studying the man. "Who's your father?" The man took another step, his throat working around emotion. "Daniel Harrington." The moment snapped into something deeper. The veteran's eyes widened. Just a flicker, but Stallone caught it. Recognition. Pain. Something buried. The old man's mouth opened, but for a second, no words came. His hand gripped the armrest, as if he suddenly needed something to hold on to. "Danny Harrington," the veteran murmured. His voice had dropped so low it was barely a whisper. "I'll be damned." The man's face tightened, his breath shaky. "You knew him?" The veteran gave a small, somber nod. "Knew him?" He let out a heavy exhale. "Son, your father saved my life." The words sucked the air out of the cabin. Even the flight attendants had stopped what they were doing, their eyes darting between the two men. The man let out a sharp breath, his fingers raking through his short hair. I never met him. He died before I was born." His voice shook, raw with something heavy, unresolved. "I've spent my whole life trying to find someone who could tell me who he was." The veteran sat perfectly still. Then he did something no one expected. He reached slowly into his duffel bag, his fingers searching through worn fabric. After a few moments, he pulled something out, a folded, faded photograph, edges curling with time. He turned it over, stared at it for a second, then held it out. The man hesitated, his fingers trembling as he took it. When he finally looked down, his breath caught. It was a picture of his father, young, in uniform, standing next to a group of other soldiers. And beside him, a younger version of the veteran himself. The man's chest rose and fell sharply, emotion crashing into him all at once. "I've been carrying that for over 50 years, the veteran said, voice hoarse. "Danny gave it to me before our last mission together." The man squeezed his eyes shut, his shoulders shaking. The entire plane was silent now. Passengers, flight attendants, even the pilot in the cockpit listening through the open door. Stallone watched, his jaw tensing. He had given up his seat for a moment of comfort, but he had no idea he had set the stage for something like this, and it wasn't over yet. The man stared down at the photograph, his fingers pressing into the worn edges as if afraid it might disappear. His breath was uneven, his chest rising and falling in slow, measured beats. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at a grainy military file or a second-hand newspaper clipping. This was real. His father, young, alive, standing next to the man sitting before him. He blinked rapidly, then swallowed hard before looking up. What was he like? Frank, the veteran, took a deep breath. His calloused fingers tapped against his knee as he stared past the man, past the plane, past everything. His mind had gone somewhere else. "Danny?" He let out a small chuckle. "Fearless idiot." The passengers let out a quiet breath, the smallest ripple of tension breaking. Frank shook his head, his gaze locked on something only he could see. He used to say the worst thing about war wasn't the bullets, the bombs, or even the fear. It was the silence. That moment right before the fight when everything goes still. That's when you know something's coming. The man listened intently, gripping the seat in front of him. Frank exhaled through his nose. "We were stationed together for nearly a year. He was the kind of guy who made you believe you'd make it home, even when you knew damn well you might not. He never talked about fear, never let it show." He paused, shaking his head. "But I knew he felt it." The man swallowed. "How did he—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Frank looked away for a second, rubbing his thumb over the faded photo in the man's hand. His voice came softer this time. "We were caught in an ambush outside Pleiku. A supply route got cut off, and we were sitting ducks. Snipers, landmines, the whole nightmare package. Danny saw me go down when a blast knocked me off my feet. I couldn't move. I was dead weight. He exhaled. And Danny, your father, didn't run. He didn't hesitate. He dragged me out of there. A sharp breath left the man's lips. His fingers trembled as he clutched the photo tighter. Frank's jaw tightened. He got me to safety. But before I could even catch my breath, I heard another round go off. I turned back. His voice broke for the first time. He cleared his throat quickly, and he was already down. The man squeezed his eyes shut, his body stiff. Frank's voice turned hoarse. I owed him my life. And all I got to say to him before he was gone was, "Hold on, Danny." His lips pressed into a thin line. But he didn't. The silence inside the plane was unshakable. No one moved. No one dared. The man's shoulders curled inward, as if he were holding in a lifetime of grief that had finally caught up to him. Frank's fingers curled around his knee. He talked about you, you know. Before we shipped out that day, he told me about his wife. Said she was pregnant. Said he was going to be a father. His voice turned rough. He never got to meet you. But I swear to you, kid, he wanted to, more than anything. The man wiped at his face with the back of his hand, his body shuddering with the weight of it all. Frank let out a breath. You're the reason he fought like hell that day. A single tear slipped past the man's defenses. He let out a quiet, broken laugh. 50 years, he murmured. 50 years I've been trying to find out who he was. And now, on a damn airplane. He shook his head, disbelief coloring his voice. Frank gave him a knowing look. Fate's funny that way. A deep hush settled over the cabin. People who had started this flight scrolling through their phones now sat glued to their seats, watching something they knew they might never witness again. But then, just when the weight of the moment seemed like it might be too much, Stallone spoke. Your dad was a real-life Rocky. Frank let out a rough chuckle, wiping at his own eyes. Nah, he was tougher. The man let out a shaky laugh, nodding, still pressing the photo to his chest. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the plane would begin its descent. But no one was thinking about the landing. The hum of the engines barely registered anymore. The air inside the cabin felt different, like something bigger than all of them had just happened. Passengers sat motionless, their phones and magazines forgotten. The flight attendants had stopped moving, their usual routine of checking seatbelts and offering drinks replaced by something far more human, listening. Frank Delaney let out a long breath, the weight of the past suddenly lighter on his shoulders. He studied the man before him, the son of his best friend, the one left behind. There was so much he wanted to say, but words had never been enough. So instead he reached into his duffel bag once more. For a moment the man watched in silence, unsure of what was coming next. Then Frank pulled out a small, worn notebook. The cover was scratched, the pages yellowed with time. He held it up, flipping it open carefully, his fingers shaking just slightly as he turned to a page in the middle. I kept this since the war, he said quietly. Wrote down things when I couldn't sleep. Letters I never got to send. Names of men I never wanted to forget. He tapped the page with a finger. Your father's in here. The man's breath hitched. Frank turned the notebook toward him, the faded ink barely legible. But there it was. Daniel Harrington's name, scribbled in neat, careful letters, followed by a note underneath. The man squinted, his eyes darting across the writing. His lips parted slightly as he read aloud, voice unsteady. If I don't make it home, tell my kid I fought for him. The air inside the plane shifted again, something deep and unspoken passing through the space between them. The man let out a shaky laugh, pressing a hand over his mouth, his body stiff but trembling. He turned to Stallone, shaking his head in disbelief. This is insane. Stallone, who had been quietly watching, arms crossed, gave him a small smile. I don't think it's insane at all. The man wiped at his eyes quickly, sniffing. Do you mind if I... He motioned toward the notebook. Frank hesitated for only a second, then nodded. It's yours now. The man's eyes widened, his fingers hovering over the weathered pages. You sure? Frank let out a small chuckle. Kid, I've been holding on to that for 50 years. It's time it went home. The man took it, his hands gentle as he cradled it against his chest. "Thank you," he whispered. Frank nodded. No more words were needed. Then, without warning, someone in the cabin started clapping. It was a slow clap at first, hesitant, then another, and another, until the entire first-class section erupted into applause. Not the polite kind, but something raw, real. People clapped for the soldier who never came home, the son who never knew him, and the veteran who had carried his memory all this time. Frank looked around, his lips twitching into a small, almost embarrassed smile. "All this fuss for an old man?" he muttered under his breath. Stallone grinned, leaning in slightly. "I think you earned it." The plane shuddered slightly as the landing gear deployed. The intercom crackled with the pilot's voice, announcing their final descent into Phoenix, Arizona. The moment was coming to an end, but everyone on that plane knew they had just witnessed something unforgettable. As the plane touched down, the wheels screeching softly against the tarmac, passengers sat in complete silence, still processing everything they had just witnessed. No one reached for their bags. No one stood up prematurely. The intercom chimed. "Welcome to Phoenix, Arizona. Local time is 4:17 p.m. Slowly, people began stirring, but the weight of the moment still hung thick in the air. Frank exhaled deeply, rubbing his hands over his knees as if shaking off the past. The man, the son of his fallen brother, was still holding onto the notebook, his fingers gripping the worn leather like a lifeline. Stallone adjusted his jacket and turned to Frank. "You got someone picking you up?" Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, son. My legs still work. Got a rental waiting." The man next to him furrowed his brow. "Do you live in Phoenix?" Frank hesitated. "Tucson. Just passing through." The man let out a breath, his grip tightening around the notebook. "Listen." He stopped himself, struggling to find the right words. Then, after a pause, he shook his head with a small smile. "I don't even know what to say." Frank patted his arm gently, his own voice softer now. "You don't have to say anything." The seatbelt sign turned off, and the usual chaos of landing should have begun. People scrambling for overhead bins, pushing toward the aisle, muttering about connections and baggage claims. But not today. Not on this flight. Passengers moved slower, some offering Frank small nods of respect as they passed. A woman in business attire reached out, squeezing his shoulder gently before moving along. A flight attendant offered him a quiet, "Thank you for your service," her voice laced with genuine emotion. And then, as Stallone gathered his things, Frank turned toward him one last time. "Mr. Stallone." Stallone looked up, one hand on his carry-on. "Yeah?" Frank held his gaze. "What you did back there?" He nodded slightly. "You didn't just give up a seat." Stallone's expression softened. "No, I didn't." Frank let out a breath and extended his hand. Stallone grasped it firmly, shaking it with the same strength that had carried both of them through this moment. The veteran's voice dropped just above a whisper. "I think I got the better deal." Stallone smiled, but his eyes carried something deeper. As Frank and the man, the son of the friend he lost, walked toward the terminal together, Stallone watched them go, a quiet thought settling deep in his chest. Greatness isn't measured by fame or fortune. It's measured in moments like this. And as he stepped off that plane, he knew. This was a flight he'd never forget. Sometimes the smallest gestures, a seat, a conversation, a simple act of kindness, can lead to something far greater than we ever expected. This story isn't just about Sylvester Stallone or a veteran. It's about all of us. It's about the way we treat people, the opportunities we have to change lives, and the moments we don't see coming. You never know when something as simple as a decision, a single moment of generosity, might set off a chain of events that someone has been waiting for their entire life. So the next time you have a chance to do something good, do it. Because you never know whose story you might be stepping into. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes, the stories we tell have the power to change lives.